So, welcome again to this second public session of the meeting of the European Alliance of Academies. I'm really happy that we arrived to this end, to this conclusion, after a very productive 2 days meeting. This morning was really intense. We had the internal sessions on the artistic projects we are developing as an alliance, and also on the actions we will take as an alliance, especially in regards to the dangerous situation in Poland, Hungary, but also other countries. We then presented the projects, both in the virtual exhibition that one can still see in the hall, and if there is someone that hasn't seen the projects, I strongly advise to have a look at them, and here with the Pecha Kucha format, and afterwards in the discussion. So, as director of this institution, I'm really, really happy of all what we achieved, and now we have the last part of the event, the public presentation about the notion of radicalization and its dangers for the arts and the humanities. And so, as a beginning of this session, I would like to call Aleš Šteger for his input, his first address. You all know Aleš Šteger. He comes from Slovenia, and he's a writer and member of the Akademie der Künste. Please, Aleš, the floor is yours.
Buenas noches a todos. Good evening. I'll try to give a first input to what should be discussed later on. Probably it will go in very different directions. So when I was asked to give this input, I was already told what the question on which we will discuss tonight will be: how does political radicalization threaten artistic freedom in Europe? The question is not easy, and it requires a couple of initial clarifications. The classic strategy of crime novels is to start looking from the perpetrator, from the end, that is, from the crime scene, and to slowly go back toward the beginning. So let's start at the end of this question: how does political radicalization threaten artistic freedom in Europe? And ask ourselves what is meant by the term Europe. I know we can easily get on very shaky ground here. All useful attempts at definitions have so far failed. Let me just point out that 50 years ago, many people in Western Europe did not understand parts of the former Soviet Empire, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and so on, as parts of Europe, not economically and much less culturally. But today these countries are, of course, an integral part of our territorial and cultural conception of Europe, which means that our concept of Europe is changing dramatically according to the current geopolitical mood. Today, we keep asking ourselves quietly whether Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Albania, Bosnia, Serbia, Northern Macedonia, and last but not least, Israel are meant somewhere when we generally say Europe. We also cannot stop asking questions that have gone a bit out of fashion today, but were very topical after 1989, namely, is St. Petersburg, Moscow, Istanbul, and increasingly London also part of what we mean when we say Europe? For our question, this has enormous consequences, which I will now go into in our brief introduction to our debate, but it is crucial, in my view, to think about these questions when we ask about artistic freedom in Europe. In any case, I think that in our alliance of academies, we do not think and cannot in any way allow ourselves to think only of the Schengen area or the EU when we talk about Europe. The coinage of artistic freedom in itself implies that there are different forms of freedoms and liberties for different groups of people, depending on who they are and what they do. Fundamental human rights, the freedoms of children, migrants, minority groups, LGBTQ+, and so on, are something other than artistic freedom. Artistic freedom itself evades general definitions. Most applicable is perhaps its definition in the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions of UNESCO from 2005. There, artistic freedom is understood as, I quote, the freedom to imagine, create, and distribute diverse cultural expressions free of governmental censorship, political interference, or the pressure of non-state actors. I repeat this, the freedom to imagine, create, and to distribute diverse cultural expressions free of governmental censorship, political interference, or the pressures of non-state actors. End of quote. The question of artistic freedom is necessarily also a philosophical, ethical question. Do we artists have the right to express just about anything, regardless of the consequences and potential conflicts that our actions and creations may provoke? Can Europe and its societies allow themselves a laboratory of freedoms in which actions, articulations, and interrogations into the most difficult matter can take place, all of which in other contexts are considered potentially questionable, even inappropriate, sometimes morally objectionable or offensive to parts of society? The case of Charlie Hebdo has become perhaps the most pointed and highly tragic example of the conflict between different experiences of spaces of freedom, the sacred and permissible among members of different ideological, religious, and political beliefs. Can we, in the changing Europe of the 21st century, afford art as an autonomous territory of practices that can be potentially offensive or controversial to those who do not accept our divisions into art and everything else, who do not recognize the special status of art and though the invisible shield which defends the practices of artists? Can we afford every art and with it the most extreme artistic positions? Can we afford even potentially harmful art and bad art that sometimes, let's face it, misuses the label of artistic creation as a cover for practices whose primary goal is not artistic creation, but probably propaganda and strengthening certain ideologies? These issues are by no means merely only theoretical questions. We who work within the field of art know that the answer to the question of whether art necessarily needs unquestioning freedom cannot be other than affirmative. Even if we demand the irrevocable autonomy of art, we all know very well that in reality the walls of our freedoms are most often very narrow and low set and strongly culturally conditioned. Social taboos, the limits of good taste, questioning the neurologic points of society, shedding light on cases of self-censorship are in a way a front on which our struggle is more or less subtle, with the aim of slowly integrating the achievements of this radical process of self-examination into a broader society, which is tolerant, open, and worth living, in a society that is, to put it bluntly, more immune to hatred, lies, intolerance, and other nonsense. We who work within the field of art know that any systematic restriction of our already often endangered and violently restricted freedoms would open a Pandora's box in which each society and each government could set boundaries in its own way. though establishing a free path to systemic censorship and political persecution of artists. The answer of many other political, global, economic, religious, technological, and capital actors to our question of whether Europe can afford a free territory of art is, of course, the opposite of ours. This evident contradiction between the notions of artistic freedom has intensified sharply in the last 10, perhaps 15 years. In some fields, the practice of general restriction of artistic practices and overt exploitation of the art sector has long been established. Years ago, I co-signed an open call by artists from all over the world to strengthen privacy and rights of individuals in the net. Just as we have achieved nothing with our call to restrict technology giants in exploiting our use of the internet, so the call for freedom of art online seems a distant utopian idea, for which it is without a doubt necessary to fight. It starts with economic subordination and a set of rules of what is allowed and what is not, with the often very problematic categories of political correctness and self-restraint in the online environment when it comes to art. While Facebook is censoring the posting of art photographs of Greek statues because they show an excessive degree of nudity, the darknet, a parallel world where just about anything is allowed, is flourishing. Our governments of Western democracies technologically enable and even co-finance the schizophrenia of our everyday online reality. When we see the threat to artistic freedom in Europe, we usually first think of the reality of rich Western societies and a couple of examples of mostly Eastern European countries where democratically elected quasi-dictators systematically curve democratic principles and adapt them to strengthen their own power and the power of ruling elites. It is a very dangerous phenomenon, where there is a well-founded fear that the phenomenon will become a normality, a kind of principle of the quasi-democratic rule of the future. In this certainly justified criticism, we forget too quickly the interweaving of the global world, the schizophrenia of the policies of countries that do not want to follow the model of Russia, Poland, or Hungary. In short, we forget all too often the pragmatic ignorance, brutal selfishness, and blindness of developed Western democracies when their interests are at stake. The rights of artistic autonomy in endangered societies, where we are facing the disintegration of democracy and pluralism, are in this sense collateral damage understood by many in a very cynic way. Economic greed, colonial superiority, and the low level of in-depth knowledge of the intercultural diversity of European cultures, a very frequent unwillingness to deepen the integration and disarm the local political rulers make Europe a self-threatening monster, too often allowing the very practices it fears become the future norm. Some time ago, I spoke to an experienced European politician. He waved his finger. "This is all," he remarked, "what Europe will do the next time when a European leader blandly violates the rule of European law, agreements, and violates the rights of people, including artists." I often remember that moment. The gentleman was from a pro-European liberal province, and as I said, he had decades of diplomatic experiences, but the realization was rather bitter. Whether we agree with him or not, I think it is undeniable that the greatest threat to Europe is Europe itself. It bears the seeds responsible for the current situation and possible solution. Finally, let us return to the initial question of political radicalization in many European countries. The radicalization itself is, of course, not a cause for, but rather a consequence of a long process. There must be a fertile ground consisting of discontent and rebellion, of unresolved traumas of the past, and a lack of recognition of one's own possible future within positive European values for radicalization to occur at all. Unlike other classical totalitarian regimes, political coups and violent takeovers of states, we see a radicalization of the understanding of democratically elected systems of power that goes hand in hand with the broadest possible legal interpretations of the frameworks agreed upon by the founders of Europe. The new generations of Eastern European leaders who learned of the threat of war horrors and devastation only from school textbooks too often appears without any historical corrections. On the contrary, the reinterpretation of historical facts and alleged historic injustice is being used as the central momentum for mass activation. In the agendas of these politicians exist historic traumas in order to be used and abused. These are populist structures that have learned the lesson from democracy that with a powerful legal apparatus and a democratically elected parliamentary majority, it is possible to democratically change everything, including the principles of democracy and the principles of freedom. These are perfidious, amoral practices that have official coverage in laws and measures. For any curtailment of rights of deprivation or of certain social groups, there is a corresponding decree, ordinance, law, as well as a legal possibility of appeal, which is normally doomed to failure. The coexistence of opponent views and the systematic support of often diametrically opposed ideological and artistic views, which was present there as a rule in the vast majority of European countries in the 1990s until the economic crisis of 2007 or 2008, has been subject to strong internal pressures and political divisions, an increasing lack of tolerance and understanding from the opposite sides. The brutality of the simple law, you are an enemy if you are not on our side. The middle path, the path of free choice, is less and less possible. And the systemic coercion into corruption and the removal of free thinking and creative people, given the bureaucratic perfidy and media silencing of the opposition, is difficult to prove. Various forms of intimidation, redistribution of state funds only to own supporters, limiting the possibility of public speech, marginalization of opponents in public space, occasional witch hunts, and abolition of free associations under various pretexts, false speech, and constant creation of state of exception, emergency measures, radical propaganda. We have all seen that, but now that it is repeatedly before our eyes, we remain powerless again. UNESCO's fundamental postulates of artistic freedom include the right to create without censorship or intimidation, the right to have artistic works supported, distributed, and remunerated, the right to freedom of movement, the right to freedom of association, the right to the protection of social and economic rights, the right to participate in cultural life. All this is becoming more and more just smoke in the eyes of those who still believe in fairy tales. Even if we do not believe in fairy tales, if we believe in crime novels instead, and with them believe in the fact that there is no complete crime, and even the most skillful perpetrator can overlook the traces that will eventually reveal it, it is undisputable that we must establish alternative forms of support for the most vulnerable. When a country fails, and every country can fail, I from Slovenia know this as well as you from Germany or from Spain or from other countries. We need a Europe that works. There is no freedom other than the one that has been fought for and preserved. And I understand our socializing and joint efforts and this conference here in this light. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Aleš. Please take your seat in your corresponding seat. You find it. And I also invite the other participants in this round table about radicalization. Dominika Kasprowicz, the director of Villa Decius, will be the moderator, and it's very symbolic because she will be the host of the next meeting of the Alliance. Well, Kraków will be the city of the next session of the Alliance. Antonio Muñoz Molina, please, and Wolfgang, he's there. They all will be presented by the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for this very rich intro made by Aleš. We were given the topic. When I saw it first, I was excited. Excited because as we are here today with my excellent guest speakers, we, I believe, will represent various approaches and perspectives on a topic that at first can be simple and complicated at the same time. It has been expressed by Aleš. Let me remind you, how is political radicalization endangering artistic freedom in Europe? This title, of course, has a very strong and evident thesis behind. But as we are here as writers, poets, lawyers, political scientists, I think that we will have something to add. Let's start with a short round of comments, two of you, to the introductory words made by Aleš. We can start with Michael, please. Michal?
With me?
Yes.
Okay.
And then we go with Mr. Molina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dominika. It's right, and I can perfectly connect to Aleš, that politically radicalized governments, but also non-governmental actors like movement, are endangering artistic freedom in Europe. There is a growing number of attacks against individual artists as well as against arts institutions. But I would step back a little bit, because it's not only political radicalization, it's a very global and complex political, economic and social crisis. And the expression of this crisis is the growing inequality worldwide. It's a growing violence against women and children all over the world. It's the pandemic, and it's the climate change. So we have to bear this in mind. And also, as Aleš pointed out, it's not only the artists that are endangered, that are attacked, even in Europe. There is a growing tendency of authoritarianism, not only in the countries of the usual suspects, but also in the center of Europe. And there is a talk about shrinking spaces for civil society actors. That includes attacks in Germany against political organization. It's tax authorities who are trying to shrink the space. It's attacks of the criminal justice in Spain against rappers, who rightly point out who are attacking the crown. It's the growing number of criminalization of solidarity movements with migrants. So it has become a real problem in Europe and outside of the Europe. So why am I leaving the narrow title, because I think it has influence on the strategy to be chosen. So obviously, you have as artists and art institution, you have a very specific protection, because I mean it's a very strong protection, and it's your right. And it's also your duty to defend it yourself and other artists and art institutions. That's true. And so you can carry out a very short-term defensive position. You can use law as a tool, the laws as a tool. You can employ lawyers as service providers, such as you did in the Hungarian intervention, which was the talk about today. But I would argue that one could also look a little bit beyond that. And so one thing is definitely, if law and international law is endangered itself in Europe and without Europe, we have to see that there is a certain erosion of international law. When you look at the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights and national courts, you see it begins with terrorism suspects and with migrants who are excluded from the sphere of law. So I would argue, if you want to defend artistic freedom, you have to defend the protection mechanisms of international law, and you shouldn't allow the exclusion of certain actors out of the law. So that would, I would say, in a way, influence the way how artists and their institutions protect themselves, but also go beyond. But when I said this is the danger for artistic freedom is just a segment of the attacks, I would argue for a more intersectional alliance in order to challenge these attacks. And that also means, and the same goes for the community I belong to, the human rights community, that means also that we have to be aware that many people regard us as elitist, as, you know, very privileged actors, and to some extent it's true. And so I think we have to connect with other actors, and as Aleš also rightly pointed out, to the most vulnerable, and connect with them and try to see where we can find common space, acknowledging the specific attacks against artists, acknowledging the language and discourse of arts, but at the same time also embedding ourselves in a much more political vision. And that could include, for example, to open the academies for a broader audience, to regard them as a forum. That means other people can come to this marketplace, and it also means to take up other issues and not only the attacks against the own guild. And I had the pleasure, and we can go much deeper into it. I had the pleasure to work with the Akademie of Fine Arts. For example, we had strong civil society performances regarding right radicalism, the NSU trial. We had very strong events on colonialism and post-colonial injustice. So I think there is a huge potential, and the more the academies, the more the artists go out of their own sphere, the more successful their defense of artistic freedom will be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for that. If you are not aware, Wolfgang is the director of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, and from my personal perspective, I really admire the way that you overcome the, let's say, legal, both the language and praxis, and outreach other networks and circles, and I believe that this is the strength also of the Akademie, also of the Alliance, European Alliance, that we get together and join forces within different fields and institutions. You were pointing to the means that can be taken and the areas that should be covered from a systemic perspective. But I believe that our second speaker, Antonio Muñoz Molina, writer and a member of the of the Real Academia Española had a perspective of the individual. Can you please refer to the introductory words and looking forward to what you have to say?
Buenas tardes. Yo creo que
Good afternoon.
la posición que los creadores, digamos,
I believe that the position of
interesados en la creación,
artists, of creators of arts, of those interested in the arts, are positioned in the face of the radicalization and the reduction of spaces for freedom in Europe is
lo he señalado, hay una
twofold.
responsabilidad cívica.
On the one hand, we have a civic duty. We have
El arte
to
es una de las libertades,
compromise.
¿no? Y la persecución contra el arte implica, es como el
We have to be
canary
committed.
in the mine shaft, ¿no?
This
Está
is a canary in the mine
practicando
shaft.
otra persecución.
These attacks against arts have a deeper meaning. Our activism shouldn't be only artistic. To fight against some of the things that he was mentioning, we not only need for artists to act with their art, they need to support causes such as public education, the state of humanities in the education, the search of the experimental method and the science should remain at the collective space. But on the other hand, the way in which that radicalization can limit not only the freedom of expression of the artists, but also their freedom to creation. Alex was talking about how we talk about freedom for imagination. That's the primary freedom of artists. That's a freedom that exists in their private space. Their big artists, creators, poets have been able to create in many societies where we come from. In the midst of a dictatorship, they have been able to create. That radicalization can impoverish the root of the freedom of spirit and the freedom of creativity. If we allow ourselves to be affected by the radicalized political positions, we're denying the freedom of liberty to perceive the world. The moment in which we divide people among them and us, and we no longer see human beings, we only see groups, whether they're favorable to us or not. In that moment, our possibility to create is disappearing. What literature has done, what arts have done, is to highlight the non-individual, the non-abstract, that cannot be limited to different categories. In the moment in which dogmatism or radicalization appear and we impoverish the position of the other, it's impossible to create with true freedom. A writer does not create characters, but rather stereotypes and caricatures. And also the perception of art is damaged by this radicalization, because the reader won't be able to value this piece of art, whether it's a painting, a song, a novel. They won't be able to value it by itself. They will judge it politically. They will lose this artistic perception that I think is one of the pillars of human freedom. We see this every day. This polarization makes people decide not to read certain books, not to read certain newspapers, or not to become close to certain artists because they are the other, the enemy. So I insist, as we should defend our freedoms, we need to defend our freedom of spirit. We shouldn't be allowed to be simplified or radicalized, not when perceiving and judging the art of others. I believe literature and arts are one of the biggest
Entonces,
antithesis
el hecho de
against
esa radicalización
radicalism.
percepción de lo concreto, de lo humano, de lo
It
libre y
prevents
de lo
this
abierto.
conception of what's free, human, and open.
Aleš, do you want to comment on the two remarks that has been done?
I've spoken with a Syrian poet who has spent several years in the jail. And of course, he said that without the inner world, he would cease to exist as a human being. But because he found out that he has this immense freedom of think what he wants, he remained who he is, and he came out as a living, wounded but living person out of the jail. And I completely agree that individual freedom, artistic freedom, starts from within, from what we carry around. But it's an individual task. It's something that is really individual, and I don't see any possibility. Perhaps you can connect with a group of people, but soon you reach the margins of the people whom you can share this struggle, the struggle of creation with. It's a struggle that each of us basically carries as his own struggle, and I completely agree. This is the basis of everything. But okay, we are now here, individuals around the world, with the same kind of struggle in different systems. And we want to create something that, how shall I say, should give us a bit support in this struggle and create environment that would be as inspiring as possible. The problem, as I see it, especially now in our societies, which are becoming more and more polarized, is that we see around ourselves, even best friends, giving up on this internal struggle. And they start believing in a different narrative. It's them and me, and us, and so we are free, but at the same time, we are this Syrian in the jail. That's perhaps why we sit here, to speak about possibilities. What can be done to make it harder for those who have the power to divide, to pursue these divisions? Because we know it's so easy to manipulate nowadays. It's so easy to create basically realities that divide. I see it much outside of what I am, how to keep basically spaces of possibilities opened. And I would love to that the discussion would reach out also into this direction. How can we create this kind of spaces?
Of course. The environment. Oh. Do you hear me? Oh, no. The environment that will be a fertile ground for creativity and bravery has to consist of various layers. And I really appreciated the remark that was made in the morning session that was pointing to the importance of the systematic solutions for the cultural institutions, academies and academies of arts, as a space, a safe space where this type of creativity could actually flourish. So I was really glad to have also Wolfgang here on board to focus our attention also on this aspect. So at this point, we're having the two perspectives, the systemic perspective and the inner perspective. Both demands creative solutions, both demands bravery, and I suppose Alliance of Academies was established exactly to figure it out, to do such a thing, to propose such a solutions. When we were discussing the possible list of topics, because this topic is so wide, we were also thinking of and discussing the very basic question. If endangering artist freedom is a goal of populist radical right or any other radical political forces, it means that it still has potential, that it's still a threat to the system. In a sense, it's a positive thing. Do you think so? Would you agree?
I think so. Que sí, ¿no? Es decir,
I think so. Yeah, one of the most striking thing was the way in which dictators in the eastern countries, those dictatorial systems, made such an effort on censorship of writers and filmmakers. And I have to say something. Those who are here coming from countries not precisely central in Europe, some of us have had a very specific experience. Alex was speaking of the margins of Europe. We, Spaniards, have been out of the margins of Europe until recently. So like the Polish or Slovenians, Portuguese, we have an awareness, a clear awareness of the difference among what we have, between what we have and we may lose. Some of us also have lived through dictatorships, and we know what it is not to have freedom of speech. And that is a double commitment for us, a civil commitment, because many of these questions we're speaking of cannot be solved through panels or symposiums. They are solved in schools, in the public schooling system, creating a society where people is well fed, fed enough, with a decent housing in order to enjoy aesthetic creation, because many times some of the problems of intolerance, of populism that we are suffering have its origin in the fact that those fundamental injustices on education, about education, health systems, and that kind of injustices make so that many people cannot neither enjoy the arts nor creating them, and also turns many people as objects of manipulation. The fact, for instance, that when writers claim for the rights, they are considered as elitists. We cannot lose trace of the relationship between injustice, democratic soundness, and artistic creation, but also the perception of the works of art in the general sense.
I wanted to ask Wolfgang about his perspective on the potential of arts and free artistic spirit to overcome and overtake the authoritarian either regimes or attempts. In your everyday work, you handle very heavy cases. How do you see the artist and artistic expression in this framework of fighting for justice?
Yeah, I think justice is a task for us all and shouldn't be left to lawyers. That's very clear. And so that requires a certain understanding how law and how justice functions. And we had a wonderful example this morning when we had Ferenc from Hungary, and he was asked, if further legal tools might help the Hungarians in the defense of their arts institution. And he said no. I mean, he was involved in our prior communications to the European Parliament, to the UN Special Rapporteur, so he was perfectly fine with that. But he said, at the end, it's our political struggle which will help us solve this problem. And that I would also say, at the end, justice cannot be achieved by lawyers, by the justice system. We shouldn't rely on them. Justice is something which goes beyond. Justice and human rights are a utopia, but on the other hand, they're a concrete utopia. And so it allows us to use certain tools in the here and now. But these tools are very narrow, because the justice system allows only narrow-minded, formulated in a specific language. And here I would say arts come into play. I mean, if these efforts are complemented, if these efforts go together, we can go to court, but at the same time make the case outside of the court. In the court, we have to go through a very narrow door. Outside, we can point to the systematic causes of a problem, and we can also lay out the historical causes, which is often absolutely ignored in a court case, even not allowed. And so here is where artists come in with their imagination, with their possibility to use all kinds of forms. And that is obviously a lot in conflict with the lawyer's mindset. But on the other hand, it can be quite successful. It can go together. And as I pointed out, we have very good examples. But the good examples require also that we acknowledge the specific discourse, the specific language of law, as well as the specific discourse and the language of arts. And that is not always the case when it comes, for example, to documentary films who are bad but claim to save a good cause, or lawyers who just step into kind of on this kind of films or theaters. I think it has to be developed, but there are very good attempts right now. May I ask a question to Alex? Because I have two questions actually to you. Because you said we have to challenge this, division of the society, this divide into us and the others. But don't you think this is only? Don't you think that this is only the tool, and we have to go to the core? And the core is this tool is used to cement unjust and equal societies. And so we have to challenge actually injustice and inequality. And the second question is, why do you say we need support? Isn't it too defensive? Isn't it, let's say, more appropriate to say we are very strong and self-confident actors, and we know how to defend ourselves, and we should go out and should connect with others who suffer the same kind of attacks on their freedoms?
How shall I say? I'll answer first the second question. I think it's as smaller society get, if they turn on a road of radicalization, it's very hard to get them back, because there is no way. Very soon, all doors are closed, and there are and there is a self-censoring or censoring principle at work, a process work, which slowly but firmly twists your mind, your mindset. You think in a specific way. If you still want to talk with intelligent people on all sides, less and less ground is there. Less and less, basically, topics you could freely talk about are there. So you desperately need, basically, institutions, platforms, communication space of imagination that is outside of your societies. And we are happy to live in many different Europes, and that Europe, the European idea at least, gives us this possibility. Germany is a big country. It's federal country, it has different realities, it's different. Also Spain. When it comes to smaller countries, these mechanisms work, I think, much stronger. And it's very hard to remain in between. When I said opposing, that's the first first question, when I said opposing this binary thinking, because it's not how art and how life works. It's not them and us. It's a big probability. It's a big plurality, basically, of possibilities that we are all the time in. What in times of radicalization happens is just that there is no way how to play with it. And to keep these zones of possibilities, of multiple perspectives possible in a society, and also to nourish this society through being there, for this you need more and more friends, I think. People who understand your struggle, people who can support your struggle. I mean, I'm not in a state of any need in my country. Don't understand me wrong, but I see an increasing tendency in many different cultures there in our part of the world, which go in a very negative way. And I see the only possible solution to this in alliances, if you like, of actors who see this threat, analyze it, and help each other. So solidarity on European level is, I think, a crucial point. If we don't have this solidarity, we are lost. Because we already, I think, or this will go too far, Europe has not integrated enough in my idea. And Europe, one of the most probable development in Europe will be, how shall I say, a liaison, a very much loose way of being together. But I think this is not firm ground for people like us and for people who would like not only to create in peace but be in peace. I mean, be in justice.
Yes, providing this space for creativity and freedom of speech and artistic expression is of crucial importance. I agree with you, something sociologists call a spiral of silence. It's actually happening not only in the countries that are now experiences this authoritarian turn, but actually it happens also via a virtual means of an online bubbles and many other tools. Let me get back to another topic, or to the topic that was touched upon, but I would really love to hear your opinions on that. We are claiming the need to secure a space for artistic freedom. In the times of radicalization, in the times of social polarization, Polish case, the two tribes that don't even see the need to dialogue, to talk anymore. Don't you think that it's quite risky to exercise the artistic freedom as it is a double-edged weapon? Antonio?
Yo creo, nosotros los
I think, well,
people in the arts,
us,
people like that, we have a very difficult task ahead, because we need to defend complexity and nuances in times of growing simplicity. So we need to make clear, humbly, we have to humbly ask the public to pay attention. We have to humbly point out to things, no? We have to invite people to accept how complex and nuanced and difficult situations are and people are, no? When I was listening to you guys, I was thinking of some books. I was trying to be, I'll try to be the most concrete I can. No? I was thinking of books who have helped me understand complex and difficult and even unpleasant things, no? I'll give you 2 examples. Last year, I read a novel by Walter Kempowski, no? Nothing Matters, I think the title in Spanish. And this is a novel about something very specific. It's the life of the East Germans, the Germans in East Prussia, who are forced to emigrate to the West because the Red Army is advancing on them. If you see this in terms of nationality, of national identity, etc., you cannot understand anything. Then you read the book and you see these characters. They are people like you and me. These are people who you have never heard about. And in case you've heard something about, it's negative. Because it was Germans who were occupying Eastern territories. But then, exclusively through the power of imagination, the power of the imagination of the writer in the first place, but also the power of my imagination as a reader, I'm able to understand. No? There's another example coming from former Yugoslavia. I'm talking about a book I've just recently read. No? I was thinking about Danilo Kish. No? I have read him a long time ago, but I didn't pay much attention to his work. No? But now you grow older and have more experiences, and the way he helped me understand the confusion and the cruelty and the darkness of the history of the former Yugoslavia. Not only the former Yugoslavia, the history of the people dominated by political dogmatism and obsessions. No? I mean, this is a unique way to understand others. I know this is a very limited weapon, and even saying weapon sounds disgusting, no? But still, this is what we have. As Henry James says, we do what we have, no? And we, as creators or artists or whatever, we have to offer this humbly and eloquently, no? Because we have to be passionate about it. No? And we have this, we are able to create this network of writers and readers and people interested in the arts. And this can be a powerful network. So we have to, with all kind of limitations, we have to say, this is what I have. This is what I can do. I can explain myself as clearly as possible. Not with arrogance. I will never claim special rights for me as an artist. No, the only claim I have is to try to do my job in the best possible conditions. I'm not even claiming to live on the results of my work. Because this is free. This is something that corresponds to the readers. No? So we have to explain this. We have to explain the power of the things we do and we love. And we have to, going against the grain, we have to say, listen, things are more complex than you think they are. Try to stop, try to pay attention, try to listen to nuances. As a writer and as a reader, try not to fall in what you said a moment ago. No? Try not to get to this moment when no connection is no longer possible. No? I think this is what we can do. This is what we have.
I think that we have there to diversify just one thing. I don't think that artists are anything special in this world and they require any special rights. But when we create and we come upon a neurologic spot, a blind spot, which we want in its entire complexity to express, and we know this is against, it's going against the booth. It's going against basically how society was built and constructed around us. It will go, it will produce outrage perhaps. We shall have the possibility to do it.
Of course.
And I think this is the fundamental right of creation that we are here to discuss, because it's being more and more endangered. I mean, obviously, it's a reality just everywhere.
I always remember a poem by Emily Dickinson, and she says, "No, most people keep Sundays going to church. I keep it staying at home." And this, no, most people keep Sundays going to church. No? This is what most people do. But I claim my right to keep it humbly, staying at home. No? And this is so powerful. No? And this is a woman who is surrounded by extremely reactionary and repressive environment. No? But this claim of hers, no? Most people keep Sundays going to church.
That reminds me of a recent case, a writer on exile that we recently welcomed to the Villa Decius in Kraków, a Belarusian dissident that used to be a candidate in a presidential election. He ended up in prison. He's one of the best-known Belarusian writers. And he came over, like many of those artists on exile, exhausted, seeing no point and no sense, trying to keep some rest. After 2 weeks, he asked for a small room to invite some Belarusian colleagues that live in Kraków to meet and to discuss his recent novel. And it happened. And what we saw, because there was a full house, of course, he's very popular in Belarus and abroad. We saw people so gray, so tired, so hopeless coming into the room. And it was also the case of the writer. And after 15 minutes, I saw a total change. When they started to talk, when they started to share the testimonies, the stories, when he started to talk about his recent novel, it all had changed. They empowered themselves. We felt as a team as kind of strangers because we were organizing it, but we don't belong to this community. After 15 minutes, they managed to empower themselves in a way that even their body language had changed. They exited the room, different people. It would last for 15 minutes, for a day, for a week, but we saw it with our own eyes. This power of freedom of speech, this power of talent, this power of eagerness to get together and to talk and to exchange was overwhelming and beautiful, but also so, sensitive and fragile at the same time. I had, as you know, a long list of questions, very detailed, but as time flies, we have 7 minutes left before we have Jurko Prochasko to be invited to conclude the session. I would like to get back to the actual topic of the session: how is political radicalization endangering artist freedom in Europe? We discussed a few other threats and dangers to the artistic freedom, but let's continue on that and maybe let's conclude a bit more. What else you see as the biggest challenge for the artistic freedom in the forthcoming years? 7 minutes.
Fortune telling.
Maybe Aleš is a bit better prepared for this question.
I was just, on purpose, I was mentioning in my speech also the internet.
Yeah.
I think it's just part of our everyday reality. I'm not a specialist in this. There are other members who should talk about it, but it's. I mean, even non-specialists like me can see that Europe is is a colony when it comes to the net. And net now is everything. It's school that you mentioned, that you expressed. It's our search engines. It's how we find, how we connect to each other. If we want, as Europe, get any kind of technological sovereignty on this level, I think soon there won't be many things and liberties that we will be able to discuss at all. Perhaps I'm wrong, but to me this is one of the major threats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, as Aleš stepped out, I can agree to him, and I see the fragmentation of public as one of the biggest dangers, and that is, I mean, there was a wonderful publication is right now out in Germany on the 60th anniversaries of Habermas' book on the Öffentlichkeit, and a very, very strong edition of Leviathan, the magazine, and they pointed to digitalization, to globalization and capitalization of media and of the public, and that leads to basically an erosion of the idea of one public forum, and further, what is it called, you know, people thinking in boxes. And this is exactly how political radicalization works. If there is no connection between these fragmented publics, this segmented parts of society, if there is no common language at all, if there is no basis at all, and the internet is obviously one of the driving forces of this development. So I can only agree with you.
There must be something to be done, no? You cannot give up and
no.
sit down and cry. No, I think, in my opinion, for example, this is not my case is, I don't participate in anything related to social media, never. It's a choice. It doesn't change anything, no, but it's a choice. I think that many of us will be opting out of this kind of world in time. No? This is only the beginning. But I'm sure many people are already getting disgusted and rejected by this kind of toxic environment. No? So I'm sure this is one of the greatest dangers we are facing now. No? The fragmentation, what happened, Brexit cannot be understood without this. The election of Donald Trump, this runs throughout everything terrible that is happening in the world now. No? But still, we have to react. We have to keep doing our job as citizens or artists and trying to open and preserve territories, autonomous territories, free territories. Well, this is what art has always been about. No? It was you mentioned Kraków in Poland. I remember, this is a very extreme case, no? I remember that during the war and the occupation in Warsaw, they were keeping the classes at the university. There was an underground university, no? Where Muñoz and people like him were teaching, no? And learning. So, because the alternative is to give up and accept fatalistically that everything is lost. I will never accept that. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe everything is lost, but I personally cannot accept that. Because I have a job to do, and this is something very concrete. I had to write a weekly column. I had to write a novel. I love writing novels, so I keep going. This is what I can do. I can do nothing else. No? So my predictions cannot be important, no? Because in any case, I know I'll try to keep doing what I do.
Our time is up. Thank you very much for your great interventions, and I hope that we gave an overview from different perspectives on what already has been discussed. But to conclude, we would like to invite our fifth guest to the stage, Jurko. Please join us, Jurko Prochasko.
Shall we go?
And the stand is yours.
Shall we go down?
We shall stay.
Ja, thank you very much for the
Muchas
invitation.
gracias.
Ich bin sehr, sehr froh, hier zu Ihnen sprechen zu dürfen. Ich bin angefragt worden, eine Art Zusammenfassung,
I'm gonna
Schlussrede
address you. I've been asked to do a kind of summary to end this session.
Möglichkeit. Das ist natürlich
It's something, of course,
gescheitert,
impossible.
anstatt von einer Zusammenfassung.
It's not gonna work.
Den Gedanken
Instead of a summary,
gekommen,
I came here with the
die
idea
weitere Diskussion oder das weitere Nachdenken noch
of
anstoßen.
going on with this discussion and to offer new ideas to this future debate. But I'm happy, and I see that I have a task now. I have already listened to some aspects that I share, but it's not going to be a final debate. This is not the worst inconvenience, of course, but I need some time. Don't be afraid. The interpreters will do their best.
Diesem Wort von mir habe ich den Titel gegeben, das ewig gespaltene und spaltende Spanien.
I have titled
Ich werde
my
versuchen, den Tatbestand der Freiheit
presentation given the title The Eternally Divided and Dividing Spanish. I will try to address the the danger to liberties in its complexity. Doing this, I will try not to say anything so that us, our artists, can think a priori that we always have the certainty as artists to have that right to freedom, and when freedom is under attack, they always come from outside. Artistic freedom is guaranteed by us. The only way we can do about that is to reclaim it, and even if it's necessary to defend it. This understanding of artistic freedom appears to us as an unrenounceable aspect of modernity, such as human dignity. Freedom is not only to be enjoyed, but also to be won. That's a series of aspects of the non-freedom of the arts as something external. I would like to reflect a little bit about this, about so many times artistic freedom suffers self-censorship, and this is also about going beyond certain lines, and how can we are going to perceive this veracity, this truth that is not always without mistakes. Sometimes artistic freedom grows through a certain self-censorship, and then it is called the capacity of acting strategically when political radicalization meets artistic freedom. Most of the times there are some consequences. Those radicalization may come even from the inner world of the artist, may be trapped by them or have the desire to radicalize. Also may have the wish to want to radicalize and see in that his or her right to have the freedom of radicalizing freedom. This means that artists are not always the victims of political radicalization. Many times they become into tools or agents, executors, or even others when freedom is attacked. They do it even consciously, invoking freedom. Madrid is such an ideal place to approach these kind of issues. Almost a century separates us from the Civil War, a classical example, almost paradigmatic of political radicalization and its devastating consequences. More than half a century has passed since Franco's death, and the country is still divided. The fronts are hardened, are not conciliable until today, but it was possible to establish a prosperous pacific coexistence, peaceful coexistence. But how many writers, publicists, journalists, Spanish or not, that felt or voluntarily call on to position themselves, how many of them would qualify as non-free, their commitment? Is it non-committed? Non-committed art is not free. They speak of the two Ukrainians, to Israel, to Mexico, to United States, to Afghanistan, always more regions and countries in the world that are affected by the pandemic of division, partly because of the political radicalization. This is almost always more true for the rest of humanity, potential. This as a result of the structural nature of social networks as a mobilizing tool, but also dividing and radicalizing tool. This makes so that our world, shared world, is something that is passing very rapidly, a very heated place. By Manuel Klein's theories, the depressive position and the schizoparanoid position of the human psyche. Since the Twin Towers 20 years ago, we have characterized ourselves by the increasing amount of the degrees of this schizoparanoid period. Now it seems that everybody is affected by this condition. Sometimes we seem condemned to crumble totally, fragmenting ever more. But this fragmentation doesn't promise any more stimulating diversity, but rather the impossibility, fundamental impossibility of agreeing upon a common ground. Sometimes the world as such seems led to a total cleansing war that finally would bring about a simplifying unity, a simple university. There are still very little areas exempt from this division. This is manifest everywhere, both in harmless dimensions like identity politics or political correctness, to the opposition of the defenders of vaccination. And almost everywhere in the world, the Taliban and the friends of a more open society in Afghanistan, the fundamentalists, Islamist fundamentalists, and the open-minded people or the egocentrics. Also in form of enthusiasts of Europe and Eurosceptics, those who admire Greta Thunberg and the enemies of Greta Thunberg. I myself, but also I feel extremely divided about the attempts by Catalonia to be independent of the states. Personally, with the experience of how deep could be the desire of independence and how urgent may be the need to get out of the anonymity of the unrecognizable, of the constant misunderstanding by ignorant people, the Catalans, lovers of freedom, have my sympathy and my empathy, but My empathy diminishes when I see how far the Kremlin, by instance, supports those attempts to independence, and many Catalans approve that. I see also in Chechnya, in Syria. I see Brexit, I see the issue of the Scottish referendum. And I see also that entire parts of the neighboring countries with occupying military force, Russia sells this out as efforts to support independence. Isn't that radicalization? Doesn't it affect also freedom of speech, or freedom of artistic expression? But I wouldn't like to want to think about threats to creative freedoms through political radicalization, like we can know today in Belarus. Even the awarded Nobel Prize wasn't immune to arrest and detention, and maybe also tortured in Belarus, not to speak of other less prominent colleagues. The pen club in Belarus has been violently dissolved by the state. Journals, literary journals, artists in prison, tortured, or even killed. This is so obvious, is everyday reality in Putin's Russia, where despotism is about keeping power at any price, but these the stakes are different according to the place, because everybody prefers to live in exile. In Germany, after an excellent novel exposing the mortal actions of the Russian Secret Service, even though he or she knows that he or she is not really safe from the attacks of the state, our first-class author lives in exile in Moscow, or also an author celebrated in the Western world organizes a troop with the desire to kill as much Ukrainians as possible in the front opened by Russia. But even then, he's invited to the book fairs in Western Europe and not treated as a war criminal. He enjoys of the respect for artistic freedom and public's attention. It's clear the case of Olga Tokarczuk, Nobel Prize. She was threatened of death by the Polish extremists, and she required state protection. With her work and world fame, she should strengthen national pride. It's evident, also obvious, the situation and the questionable status of artists and intellectuals in a homogenized Hungary, forced to collaborate spiritually or to migrate internally or externally. But now in Europe, there are more subtle dilemmas. In today's Germany, an author, also internationally renowned, has been deprived of loyalty and cooperation by his publisher because he's been accused of standing for rightist ideas. This has provoked controversy even in his opponents, ideological opponent, and this triggers a certain radicalization. The Charlie Hebdo, the case of Charlie Hebdo, where we say that we are a majority in the Western world, we set out on the tenet that there are no limits to the freedom of the art, but limits to the real political action. To mix up this would be rude and transcendental with serious consequences, like mixing up thought and fact. We forget that there are other rhythms of the art as a stimulus, provocation, escalation, as contribution to the radicalization. But today, I would like also to think loudly about the way also artists are trapped by radicalization, becoming committed speakers of one side or the other, and also about participation in radicalization by free artists, departing from the lack of inner freedom, or as a result, they are trapped by the inner censorship of not letting anything going away from her or his chosen position. I would like also to speak about the contribution of artists to radicalization, their role about endangering freedom, and their role and responsibility of keeping freedom and de-radicalize. Even if we don't concede much influence to art and intellectuality, if there is a certain radicalization, there is the result of a certain perceived abuse of artistic freedom. Frequently, art in itself makes an effort to achieve radicality. The very artist considers him or herself as an innovator, a finder. The compulsion to be radical is normally listened among artists, not just in the realm of aesthetics. Maybe the radicality of art could sometimes contribute to political radicalization, or is this an absurd position? Sometimes happens intentionally as a deliberate provocation, and other times the provocation through art. Also a radicalization that is unexpected. The recent novel by Borjan Paniuk, Nights of Plague, that caused indignation of people that seem to be sympathetic to him because of the aesthetic of representation. Dictators have always tried to suffocate the freedom of the art or submitting the talents to the service that turns freedom into a caricature, but aesthetically wasn't ever unfruitful. But also Sartre thought that when he defended the Stalin and the Stalinism as the human form of Stalinism as a form of defending humanism. Also, the writer, my fellow countryman, Manes Pervat from Galicia, that not just to question his own radical collaboration with communism, but also the orthodoxy of the French agreement with Sartre and the complicity with people accused of Stalinist crimes.
How he criticized and tried to ruin others. How many others like Sartre ignore the crimes of Soviet communism, try not to endanger the supposedly fair cause, the antidote against capitalism and fascism. How many were corrupted by the Soviet Union? How they go into a human alibi? And the representation against artists in the Soviet Union. Very different. Orwell, Kozla, but also Daniel Kompenit, Wolfgang, Jörg Dunen had the courage and the intelligence to review their own creativity and radical work. Hemingway, Picasso, among others, were fully convinced that given their genius, they couldn't only serve to a perceived truth, but they had to do it. They weren't free in their decision-making. Of course, they were not. Several Soviet artists did the same, but for very different reasons. We can assume that they took a decision from a certain slavery because the Stalinist regime, they had to of pay obedience to was the legacy of an unbelievable radicalization. The Bolshevik, who systematically and strategically radicalized the Soviet society using cynical measures based on the laws of Marx. The Bolshevik took power and they created a reign of terror. When he joined in 1936, when the Spanish Civil War began, and many European and American intellectuals searched proximity to the Communist Party only to be on the fair side of history. Then Sperber quit in Paris. There is a connection which is called the role of the Soviet Union. And the German TV show Babylon Berlin, who is widely acknowledged and fairly so, shows how the young Soviet Union tried to achieve social division with all the means possible by funding not only those on the right, but those on the left. Of course, you can discard this as fiction, but something tells me that this thread, this is the least fictional aspect of the show. Sperman, in the last few years, has surrendered to the temptation to be on the side of those who are fair. How can something bad come from the first communist country in the world? And those who knew wanted to read in this the lesser evil. Is not the case in the case of Sperber and Camus, among others. Through the Spanish Civil War, he lived through it, and that kept him against it. Is there any freedom left in a radicalized situation? Is there a possibility of freedom of choice? For me or for you? On the other hand, is completely out of the question that from one side of this hugely radicalized position is right, and the struggle for a fair cause. Cannot this also be radicalized? And doesn't this actually happen quite often? The radicalization, the escalation. And the freedom to be able to take a radical choice, is not that freedom of art? Or isn't true freedom to allow this radicalization to happen, or to ignore through escapism, through internal migration in aestheticism, in art for the sake of art? Wouldn't this reality make you question, relativize, and search a third objective position? Is there an objective position in a radicalized situation or not? I wrote these lines on November 21st, the Day of Freedom and Dignity here in Ukraine. 8 years ago, here began the peaceful protest known as Euromaidan, or the Revolution for Dignity, that later became radicalized more and more as an answer to the state violence. In Belarus, this prevailed. The consequences are well known. Also, what is known as migration crisis in the border with Poland, which was in truth a type of hybrid war between Russia and Belarus against the EU and the Western world in general. What is this migration crisis? Is it a try to de-escalate, or is this a testimony to naivete? Will it be radical to talk about an attack? Is it possible to develop a true position against a phenomenon that has been wrongly coined the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, experimented a violent radicalization. It is thus impossible to take a free and clear position regarding it. Is everything distorted as a result? The overwhelming majority of Ukrainian artists are for this revolution, and many took part in it. Are they all committed to their freedom? Are they all incapable of having a free opinion, or is freedom exactly the ability to do this? So we also try to seek a middle position for the sake of achieving objectivity. What can be more radical than a war? A Russian war against Ukraine that can become even more radicalized. Can we take part in radical events without necessarily developing oneself radical perspectives? My contemporaries in Ukraine write books, novels, theater pieces about this war, not because they have to, but because they can't help it. They say that it is their own wish. What do they see? What is it that they don't see? What is it that they don't want to see, or what they can't? Are they themselves under the influence? Yes. Are they neutral? No. Do they no longer have freedom? Well, maybe some freedom. Does it mean that all of them are blind? It's quite possible. Does this mean that they've lost their internal freedom? Not likely. Probably because they're very different. Something is obvious. It's not us, the ones who created this war, and we didn't want it. Not a single Ukrainian person wanted this war, especially not artists. Of course, they will prefer to write about something else. And to find here a middle ground position, we cannot apply relativity to freedom. One can also apply relatively, conscious or subconsciously. Then one is closer to freedom if you look at it from a different perspective. The moral relativity to the relativity of values is just one small step. We live in an era of post-truth, and the most sophisticated techniques that are intended to create the impression there are a multitude of synonymous truths, which in the end means there is no truth at all. Why is Putinism in its divisive, polarizing, radicalizing, and destabilizing activities and effects not properly recognized and combated? Why don't you see the crude propagandistic and disinforming Russian state broadcaster, Russia Today, in direct danger to freedom of expression? I believe that in large part it is due to the unwillingness in the West to part with the cherished and comfortable patterns of thoughts and feelings that state that the Soviet Union was a symbol of socialist justice and anti-fascist international solidarity. And everyone who is in conflict with Russia is either bad reactionaries or genuine fascists. Isn't this idea also very radical and therefore radicalizing? Precisely because of its simplification that screams to heaven. But can those who have fallen for it still be held free? The lack of freedom of the artists through their own prejudices, their own ignorance, and self-centeredness is another aspect of the subject that concerns me today. By the way, the fact that at the moment when I write these lines, a huge, highly armed Russian army is encircling my country on three sides ready to attack it, perhaps at the end of January, beginning of February, radicalizes us even more, and we will be very happy to be free from this radicalization and this reality. And one last word, the Donetsk-born Ukrainian philosopher and religious scholar Igor Kozlovsky and the journalist and writer Stanislav Vasilyev, who also came from there, were, like many Ukrainian intellectuals and artists, arrested by the occupiers after the occupation of parts of Donbass and tortured for months in the notorious concentration camp under the now terribly ringing name Isolagisa, a former art foundation, where from 2009 to 2014 there was a public space for the free exchange of opinions between artists, and originally the eponymous Soviet insulated material factory. They were only released as a result of vehement international efforts on a prisoner exchange, although they were not prisoners of war, but civil intellectuals, that they can now, having arrived in the free Ukraine, write books about this time and have public conversations about how they fared during this time. Is that their freedom to be able to tell about it, or the lack of freedom to have to write about it? Nowadays, we are all somehow the eternally divided and divisive Spain. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Jurko, and thanks to you all, this wonderful round table, and also this very personal and brave perspective and comparison between Spain and the Spanish war and the actuality in Ukraine. Ahora vamos a pasar al español.
Now we're going to pass to Spanish, to the final session that will be by the Ambassador of Germany and the Ministry of the Madrid Regional Government for Culture, Sport. Those have made possible this event, co-organized and ideated by the Circle of Fine Arts and the Akademie, the Künste. Without more, the word is to the Ambassador of Germany, Wolfgang Dold. The Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Sports, Marta Rivera de la Cruz, Mr. President of the Círculo of Fine Arts, Juan Miguel Hernández León, Director of the Círculo of Fine Arts, Valerio Rocco, President of the German Academy of the Arts, dear friends of the freedom of the arts. Before anything, I would like to congratulate the Circle of Fine Arts and the Academy of the Arts with my whole heart. As embassy, we have supported this important meeting that we have had until the end of it, so important from the beginning. It's such a joy to see that these days this has been strengthened after have been founded in Berlin during the presidency of Germany of the European Council. We are living through a period in which borders in Europe are not so much between the countries, but inside the countries. Among those who see democracy as a common good that has to be defended and free culture as one of its foundations, and those who despise both things, the current times, this alliance of European academies is a symbol of central importance that sets a trend. As an ambassador of Germany, I feel optimistic. I'm personally happy to see that the manifesto of this alliance describes the European Union as a cultural good that has to be protected. to me, the European Union, more in general, Europe, is identical to the idea of freedom. And freedom is a dynamical and dialectical process. Europe is a continent of freedom that expresses itself through the differences and its unity, through the harmony in diversity. But the European history owes its existence to the extraordinary capacity of indignation against the threats to freedom. It has a dramatic, inherent, intrinsic determination to crush all obstacles to freedom and make arise new spaces for reflection, new forms of life, completely different. But freedom as a fundamental idea for Europe doesn't represent an idyllic state. Freedom by its own nature is linked to the capacity of dispute and contradiction. Still today, it's true that a great liberal like Ralph Dahrendorf never tired of reminding his fellow country people. The debate keeps democracy alive. Those who don't want to discuss are bad for democracy. To express this with a contemporary image, democracy, although it's healthy, needs constant breathing. The freedom of the art provides to democracy the oxygen it needs to survive. Along these lines, I'm happy that the institutions that participate here assume other tasks beyond the particular task of cultivating the cause of the arts. I would like to quote Professor McApfel that said, today the most important is that we engage, we commit to cultural political issues, and that we try to enlighten people with the arts. As German ambassador, I accept with very happily this commitment to defend European values through culture by the Alliance of Academies. Hopefully, the last days here in Madrid have been full of valuable meetings for all of you, that you have debated, and most of all, that you keep actively defending the values that we debate here. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, embajador.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador. And now I invite to come up to the stage to Marta Rivera Cruz, Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Sports of the Madrid Regional Government. Please, Minister. German Ambassador, President of the Círculo of Fine Arts, Director of the Círculo of Fine Arts, Director of the Akademie, from the Künste. I'm happy to participate with you in this closing ceremony of the Alliance of European Academies hosted by Madrid. Thanks to all participants for being present here in this closing session. These have been days of analysis, study, reflection, and interpellation. In these times where everything goes so fast, it's especially necessary to find spaces for calm thinking, but also passionate one. In this strange time, we cannot give up to passion or calmness. And this is useful to think about doubts and interrogation. The other is essential to understand that nowadays we cannot be soft. generation that saw the wall break down have taken many things as understood. We thought that nobody could be a threat to freedom, but we cannot relax, and we must be alert to any form of regression. The longest period of peace and prosperity that Europe has known cannot be an excuse to forget the threats of populism and nationalism that are the most worrying nightmare for our country. Against both, nothing is more powerful than culture. Our common heritage, overflowing, should keep us from all deliriums that are a step back. Our old Europe, on which walls is written the history of our nation, keeps an invaluable treasure: the Pantheon, the Guernica, the Colosseum, the Vittorio Samothrace, the Pergamon, the works of Rembrandt, the gold of Klimt, the verses of Dante, remembering that the love moves the sun and the stars, or the silhouette of Don Quixote facing non-real giants, but real were his sense of justice and his bravery. I want to think that some of the threats on us are just windmills and not invincible, but we will be able to use a dagger and face them. Our heritage is very wealthy, and we have the duty of legate it to our new generations. On our shoulders is the responsibility of preserve it and claim it against those who doubt it. That's what you have done these days, to claim our common heritage, legacy, and our obligation of defending it and engage battle against those who put it into question. Thanks a lot.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thanks a lot,
gracias,
Minister. Thank you,
and so
Ambassador.
we come to the end of these very intense days. It's been really a pleasure to be the host, that the Círculo de Bellas Artes could have hosted this marvelous encounter that we organized together with the Akademie der Künste. I would like to thank our president, Juan Miguel Hernández León, who is always supporting this kind of international activities and understands the importance for an institution as ours, as Casa Europa, as the House of Europe in Madrid, to be in contact with the other European institutions. I would like to thank Janine Merapfel, who, as we have said many times during these days, was the engine at the beginning of this alliance. Her enthusiasm and her personal commitment made possible this alliance, this network, and so we are extremely grateful to her. I would like to thank also to the team of Círculo de Bellas Artes all their dedication during the past month in cooperation with the team of the Akademie der Künste. It was really something new for us, working so closely with another institution, to the point that at certain times we had the impression that we were one only body, one only institution. And in this sense, I think this is the kind of examples we have to follow. This is true cooperation, the fact that we were able to join here in Madrid, we were able to organize this, and if this was possible, was mostly thanks to many people, but I would like to mention one person, which is Christiane Aleš, who is an incredible worker. She and her very small team are I don't know if the brain, but the muscles of the alliance, and so we are extremely grateful to her. Thanks to the 65 European alliances and cultural centers who attended this conference, some of them, half of them here in Madrid, half of them through the streaming. I think the level of the discussions was extremely high, also in the internal part, and so I think we are succeeding as an alliance, and therefore I'm extremely grateful to all of you. And I have nothing else to say. The only thing is, see you next April in Kraków. Thank you to you all.